Late on a Sunday night in 1970, police respond to an anonymous phone call. They're called to a domestic dispute at an address in North Omaha's Black Ghetto. The house seems abandoned, but to investigate further, the officers decide to go in. In the blast, one officer died and 4 were injured. A year later, 2 black radicals, David Rice and Edward Poindexter, were jailed for life for this bombing. Today they're still in jail and unlikely to be released. Both men believe they were framed.
I was reminded constantly that we're going to get you, we're going to get you, nigga, we're going to get you, we're not going to rest till we get you. So I said, well, good luck, you know, and they were right, of course.
On a winter evening in 1968, Kenneth and Caroline Olson prepare to play tennis. 2 men rob them and order them to lie face down. Caroline Olson died in the attack. Geronimo Pratt, a young Black Power activist, was jailed for life for this murder. For more than 20 years, Pratt has maintained he is innocent.
I didn't kill Mrs. Olson. I didn't murder anyone. I'd rather for people not to listen to me. I'd rather for people to go to the facts. You could listen to what a person say all day, but it's best to check the facts out. And the facts speaks for themselves.
David Rice, Edward Poindexter, and Geronimo Pratt were prominent figures in the militant Black Power organization, the Black Panthers. All 3 men believe that they were framed by the police and the FBI because of their political activity. They say they are America's political prisoners. Geronimo Pratt was born in the Mississippi Delta town of Morgan City. During his childhood, the town was still segregated between black and white. Geronimo was sent to an all-black high school. When he left school at 17, Pratt volunteered for service in Vietnam. He served 2 years in action and was twice wounded. He was decorated for bravery and promoted to sergeant. Like many other black soldiers in Vietnam, Geronimo Pratt followed the progress of the civil rights struggle back home.
I was standing on the bunker, and the news came from someone's radio that Martin Luther King had been assassinated. And it was automatic reaction from everyone. It was just a silence, a big silence, and it was very sad day. Even though Martin Luther King wasn't so much of our hero, he was our mothers and fathers' heroes. Because we were more, excited about the Malcolm X type, or the more, fiery and militant, because of our age and persuasions. But Martin had been killed, and something was about to happen. I mean, you just knew it. And that's something you knew you better have been on the right side of the fence, and you knew you had to be involved because no one could escape it,
Appalled by Martin Luther King's assassination, Pratt left the army and returned to America. He joined the Black Panthers. The Black Panthers were a militant black power organization committed to revolutionary social change in America. They also urged the black community to defend itself against racial attacks.
Organizing them and giving them political knowledge about the true situation, and organizing them and teaching ourselves that we must arm ourselves. We have to put a shotgun in every door, from door to door, from block to block, from community to community, from city to city, from state to state, across this racist nation, so we can have the power in our hands. So we can have the power in our hands.
Geronimo Pratt rose to head the Los Angeles chapter of the Panthers. Kathleen Cleaver was also a leading figure in the movement.
It was a very, very tense time. People were followed, they were spied on. We felt the police were trying to destroy our organization and that we had no intention of letting that happen. It had the feeling of the early stages of a war. Everyone was very tense, very excited, and we were determined that this was the time to make a big revolutionary change.
In July 1969, hostility between the Los Angeles police and the Panthers came to a head. After a 14-hour gun battle, the police arrested the Black Panther leadership, including Geronimo Pratt. Pratt was then charged with the tennis court murder, which had taken place 3 years before. This word-for-word transcript is the only record of his trial. We've used it to reconstruct the evidence which convicted Pratt in 1972. The key to the prosecution case was the evidence of a former Black Panther called Julius Butler. He testified in court that on the evening of December the 18th, 1968, Geronimo Pratt came to his apartment and produced a gun.
Anybody see you?
No.
Then, according to Butler, Pratt confessed to him that he had just killed a woman on a tennis court. To back up Butler's testimony, there were two eyewitnesses. The first was a woman called Barbara Reed. Barbara Reed ran a shop near the scene of the murder. She testified that she remembered Geronimo Pratt coming into her shop with another man minutes before the shooting. The second eyewitness, Kenneth Olson, was the husband of the murdered woman. He identified Geronimo Pratt as one of the men who shot his wife. The prosecution then presented forensic evidence. A ballistics expert testified that bullets found on the tennis court matched with the gun belonging to Geronimo Pratt. The evidence seemed convincing, but even so, the jury took 10 days to reach a verdict.
When we delivered our verdict, the jury foreman stood up and said that we had found him guilty. The defense attorneys requested an individual polling of the jury, and for each count, we had to indicate guilty. After we had done so, I believe it was 4 times. I don't remember exactly how many counts there were against him. As that day, by the way, he was in hand and leg chains with prison clothes on, as he had not been during the trial before. And as he walked by us, he called us racist pigs.
Even Pratt's defense team admit the prosecution had a good case.
There were 2 eyewitnesses that claimed that they could identify Pratt as the man who had committed the murder. Although they were shaken somewhat on cross-examination, still juries tend to regard eyewitness identification evidence as very solid. There was an alleged confession by Pratt to another member of the Black Panthers, who was actually a man who was the principal witness against him at the trial, claimed that Pratt had told him he had done it. And those are strong lines of evidence. And it's not hard to see why he was convicted at the first trial, given what the prosecution was able to produce and what the defense didn't know at the time.
Geronimo Pratt has always said that on the night of the murder he was 500 miles away from Los Angeles, at the Black Panther headquarters in Oakland. At the trial, this alibi was not believed, but since then, new witnesses have been found.
I remember that Geronimo was in Oakland with me during the week of the murder. And I remember it because of significant events that happened, but also because my job was to log people into Central Headquarters. I was in charge of security. I was the person that when people came from out of town and when Geronimo came, he had to check in with me in order to find out what was on the agenda.
According to Landon Williams, on the night of the murder, there were a series of meetings around Oakland. Pratt attended them all. One meeting was held at the house of a white supporter of the Black Panthers.
I'm certain about what happened during that period, not from sitting back now and sort of recollecting 20 years later, but when these things were happening, I got locked up. I was arrested by the Denver County Police and the FBI and locked into isolation for 2.5 years. From June 1969 through October 1971. And I had limited stimulus and contact with other people. So what I did was all these things, I continually replayed these in my mind. So now, although it's still 20 years later, there are impressions that were imprinted into my mind because it was all I had to deal with while I was in isolation. So I know emphatically that Geronimo wasn't in Los Angeles, but in fact was there with me in Oakland at that time.
This confirmation of Pratt's alibi is just one part of a mass of new evidence found since the trial. Our investigation has now revealed serious flaws in every aspect of the prosecution case. Many members of the jury were apparently swayed to convict by the strength of the forensic evidence. But this is now highly suspect. At the trial, a ballistics expert called Dwayne Wolfer convinced the jury that shells found on the tennis court had been fired from Pratt's gun. But Wolfer's professional credibility is now in doubt.
Well, Dwayne Wolfer's rather notorious. He's mishandled some large cases, including the Robert Kennedy assassination and some preliminary work on the Charles Manson murders and other cases. In fact, the Court of Appeals called him incompetent, and he was sued in connection with the Robert Kennedy case at one point and was deposed. And I read his deposition, and I don't believe the man could pass a 9th grade science test, really. He was the forensic expert, though, for the prosecution in Pratt's trial.
It isn't just defense lawyers who distrust Wolfer. In 1975, the California Appeal Court described his testimony as given with a reckless disregard for the truth and negligently false. The court said it was obvious Wolfer knew very little about what he was talking about. In the light of these judgments, Wolfer's ballistic testimony now appears worthless. Even at the time of the trial, the eyewitness identifications were questionable. Kenneth Olson, the husband of the murdered woman, and Barbara Reed, the hobby shop woman, both made their identifications several years after the murder. Mrs. Reed gave many conflicting descriptions of a man she admitted she saw for only a few seconds.
On the night of the murder itself, a forensic drawing, an identikit type of thing was done by a police artist, and the description of the short man that she gave then didn't resemble Pratt at all. And at trial, they were able to confront her with this old drawing, which she had to concede didn't look like Pratt at all, but she said, well, I remember him better now. Those were her words.
The hobby shop woman was one of the shakiest witnesses the prosecution had. There's a joke that prejudiced people say, oh, you can't tell the difference between any black or any other ethnic group. They all look the same. I immediately thought of that when that woman began to speak. It was clear to me that in her mind, every black individual looked the same.
Kenneth Olson was more convincing. In court, he showed no hesitation in identifying Pratt as one of the men who shot his wife.
Mr. Olson was obviously an individual that we all felt for. We had seen pictures of his wife murdered and her dead body. So when he got up on the stand, the feeling that we had was, this is a man that, you almost felt guilty not believing him. But his eyewitness was, I would say he's about 50-50 believable. There was one part of you that said, boy, if somebody was looking at me with a gun, I would remember what he looked like. And I remember the jury foreman saying, don't you think you'd remember the person that shot your wife?
But it's recently emerged that a year before Pratt's trial, Kenneth Olson identified someone else as his wife's killer, a man who looked nothing like Geronimo Pratt.
And he got up and said, that's the man who did it, and pointed at Geronimo Pratt. That's devastating evidence. What the defense lawyers didn't know, what the jury never knew, is that a year before, in a police lineup room, he did the same thing. He said, that's the man who did it, and the voice convinces me. He was 100% sure, and he picked out someone totally different. He picked out a guy named Perkins, who the police never prosecuted.
William Dunn is an appeal court judge who was outvoted in trying to grant Geronimo Pratt a new trial.
The question is whether or not it would have made a difference to the jury that Olson had identified some other person. I think it might well have made a difference for this reason. If 12 people are sitting in judgment and the crucial issue is, did the defendant commit the crime, and it appears that the victim of the crime on a previous occasion, when arguably his memory was better, was not sure, in that he either identified somebody else or said he couldn't positively identify the defendant. It seems to me that ought to be made to the jury, because it's an equivocal identification. When you just say at the time of trial, yes, the defendant did it, and it's not made known to the jury that on a previous occasion you were not so sure, then it seems to me it makes a difference in terms of how they judge the case and how they judge your credibility.
Without the discredited eyewitness and forensic evidence, the only testimony still linking Geronimo Pratt to the murder is that of Julius Butler. According to Butler, Pratt came straight to his apartment from the scene of the crime and confessed to the murder. Butler told the court that he was so worried by what he heard that he decided to make a written record of Pratt's confession. Butler then said that he telephoned a friend, Duane Rice, and arranged a meeting in order to give him the confession document for safekeeping. In a statement, Butler's friend, Duane Rice, explained what happened next. He said that just as Julius Butler was giving him the confession document, 2 FBI men rushed forward and tried to take it from him. Rice says he was amazed that they appeared to know exactly what they were waiting for.
Give me that letter. Well, where are you going to get this letter?
This thing that was supposedly had taken place between just the two of them. Actually, there were at least 2 FBI agents present at the scene. They had to have been called by Butler. Butler had set up the meeting with Rice at a certain street corner, and if the FBI was present at that street corner at that very moment, it can only be because Butler had also called them.
Was Butler in fact working for the FBI? At Pratt's trial, Butler was asked on oath whether he was an FBI informer. He repeatedly denied that he was. New evidence shows he was lying. During the period in question, Butler was meeting regularly with FBI agents as an informer. The FBI's own records, now released under the Freedom of Information Act, show Julius Butler was an FBI informant at the very time he first came forward with his story about Pratt's confession.
For the information of San Francisco Division, captioned individual and admitted ex-member of the Black Panther Party, BPP, in Los Angeles, is furnishing information to the Los Angeles Division on a confidential basis.
If in fact Julio Butler was an FBI informant, it seems to me that would have made a substantial difference to the trier of fact, the jury. Not from the standpoint that he was or wasn't an informant, but bearing upon his credibility. if he comes into court and testifies to one thing and it turns out that that testimony is untrue, then he has engaged in duplicity in the courtroom. And if he engages in duplicity with regard to that, then arguably he might not have been totally truthful with regard to the essential testimony, which was that Mr. Pratt had confessed to the crime.
Had I known whether that Julius Butler was an FBI informant, I would have disregarded his testimony completely. I think it's unconscionable that we did not have the full evidence when we are asked to make a decision that has such an impact. And in effect, we were made to be puppets. They molded the case for us to hear what they wanted us to hear and not the whole story. And I feel duped.
Not only was the jury not told that Julius Butler was an informer, they were not told about the existence of a secret FBI counterintelligence program, COINTELPRO. COINTELPRO was an illegal operation set up to destroy the Black Panthers. It used widespread bugging and surveillance, as well as a dirty tricks campaign against Panther leaders. Newly obtained documents reveal the scope of COINTELPRO operations against the Black Panther Party, the BPP. One directive orders:
officers are instructed to submit imaginative and hard-hitting counterintelligence measures aimed at crippling the BPP.
Another FBI memorandum explains:
purpose of counterintelligence action is to disrupt the Black Panther Party, and it is immaterial whether facts exist to substantiate the charge.
As leader of the Black Panther Party in Los Angeles, Geronimo Pratt was kept under constant surveillance. Documents from the FBI's Los Angeles office refer to a secret campaign to destroy him.
Operation Number 1 is designed to challenge the legitimacy of the authority exercised by Elmer Gerard Pratt, BPP Deputy Minister of Defense for Southern California.
Constant consideration is given to the possibility of the utilization of counterintelligence measures, with efforts being directed toward neutralizing Pratt as an effective BPP functionary.
A few weeks before his trial, the Los Angeles FBI reviewed the Pratt case. Wes Swearingen was an FBI agent at the time.
It was my personal feeling that the supervisor was explaining to us that, we finally got someone that we're going to hang. In bureau terminology would be to neutralize. But my feeling was that Pratt is going to be framed for murder if they can get away with it.
Geronimo Pratt has so far spent over 21 years in jail. Exceptionally, his first 8 years were spent in solitary confinement.
When I'm in a stressful situation, I think of which a lot of people do, my earlier days when life wasn't so complex, and I pull out those things that made me feel so good, The magnolias, how the magnolias would come out in the summer and everything smelled, everything would smell perfume. And then the shrimp boats, the rivers, and I just like country, man. I just like the space. Well, of course, my mother, my mother's boy. And the family, what's that family feeling? Everybody pulling together. I miss my friends. I just miss the. I don't know if I could ever be a hunter again after Vietnam, but I used to love to hunt, but I really miss fishing, you know. Fishing that river.
In spite of the overwhelming weight of new evidence, Geronimo Pratt's lawyers are pessimistic about his chances of freedom.
There's a bunch of cowards in the Court of Appeals when it comes to political decisions. When it comes to political cases, the courts are afraid of the FBI. They're afraid of the political implications of a case like this, and they push it away. And the way to push it away is to say to the lawyers and Mr. Pratt, everything you raise is simply speculation. There's no proof. If these people had the guts to be honest, they say there's so much proof, we're ashamed this man ever spent a day in prison.
You know, you asked the question, why would it concern me, a judge of the court, whether Mr. Pratt or any individual got a fair trial? After all, that's my lifeblood. That's what I am. I'm a judge, and it's my job to see to it that people are treated fairly, that people are treated dispassionately in the courtroom. The judiciary is one of the foundational bases of a free society. And if you don't have, first of all, an independent judiciary, if you don't have a judiciary that has backbone, a judiciary that will look to see whether or not a person has a fair trial and will stand up and stand hard and fast against the current to make certain that people have a fair trial, you're not going to have a free society. If we allow one person to be treated unfairly because he's guilty, that is to say, we conclude he's guilty before we really know, then that can happen to any of us. It can happen to you, it can happen to me, it can happen to anyone, and we don't want that.
In the early 1970s, the police and the FBI stepped up the pressure on the Black Power movement. Across the country, black militants were arrested and brought to trial. In Omaha, Nebraska, David Rice and Edward Poindexter were arrested and tried for first-degree murder. In Part 2, we investigate their case.
My partner and I had just finished a little, like a lunch break. We never really went out of service. We just ate while we were on duty. Got a big plate of barbecued ribs and sat in the projects and, you know, right in the area and ate them, and heard a call come out of a woman screaming.
Woman screaming for help, possible rape in progress at an address at 28th and Ohio. I didn't see anybody leaving the house, or I didn't see anybody in the alley, and I walked over to the window and I was peeking in the window when I saw Officer Tess and Officer Menard walking from the kitchen to the front door area.
We kind of worked our way through the rooms. I could tell where he was because of the flashlight, and Larry was about, I'm guessing, 10, 12 feet in front of me. And he had bent over the suitcase, and that's the last I remember of that.
I don't like to see somebody get by with murdering somebody. And just plain and simple. You know, when you're investigating homicide, there's a saying that you are in that man's shoes to see that he gets justice. And I always did believe that. You know, how is that dead man going to get justice if you don't do it for him? And that's my principle.
A week after the bombing, Officer Larry Menard was buried. The police were convinced the Black Panthers were responsible for the killing.
We were under constant surveillance, constant harassment. A great deal of energy and resources was spent on trying to provoke us into a confrontation. One, involving shooting, of course. We couldn't leave a building and enter the streets without being frisked, harassed. This went on around the clock. Not a night went by, man, that somebody wasn't absolutely, totally, unnecessarily pounced upon by the police. Not a night went by, man. This was like 7 days a week.
The Black Panthers published a newsletter called Freedom by Any Means Necessary. David Rice was the editor.
We did on occasion talk about the whole business, in the newsletter of having a right. Well, we talk about it more than occasionally, about having a right to defend yourself against police attack.
If we're talking about off the pig, and we're serious about this, then we're talking about urban guerrilla warfare, and we're talking about people using their brain. And you don't use your brain by throwing some bottles and some bricks and some pigs and doing some cruising. You off the pig by the means that are available to you, which can be easily obtained.
Both David Rice and Ed Poindexter were visible in the community. And David Rice was very free about what he thought the answer to these problems were, and they generally included killing police officers. Ed Poindexter, not as vocal, was always present, always around.
Marvin McClarity was one of the few black police officers in Omaha at that time.
I knew I had feelings that they were out to get those two because they were probably the most, the two that were most vocal. They were the two that people viewed as being a threat. The police did.
Well, there wasn't a policeman on the job that didn't know who done that. It was just a matter of being able to prove it. And that's what we've done.
A week after the bombing, officers Jim Perry and Jack Swanson led a raid on David Rice's house in North Omaha. Rice was in Kansas City giving a speech at the time. He'd left his house unlocked. Both Jim Perry and Jack Swanson later testified they found a box of dynamite in the basement. Other officers aren't so sure. Marvin McClarity is convinced the dynamite was planted after the area had been cordoned off.
I was on duty. We saw them bringing items out of that house. The thing that was so striking to me and to those two officers that I was with was the fact that the police had blocked off 29th to 30th on Parker Street, and they blocked that off to vehicular traffic and to pedestrian traffic. Then they said they found something in that house, and being a police officer, the first thing that strikes you is funny and saying, hey, something's wrong here because of the way that that search was conducted. And that was when we drew our suspicions that it could have been something that was planted in that house, and to this day I still believe that was planted in that house.
It's a lie. I was there, I found it. I didn't personally discover it, but I was there when it was discovered and went right to where it was. It was there.
They found dynamite in my house. I had guns, in my house, but those guns were legal, registered in my name. I would have been very cautious about even somebody presenting the idea of having something in my house, that somebody could get some time for. Because I always suspected that there would be some kind of raid.
Although the police had the dynamite they claimed to have found in David Rice's house, they lacked any firm evidence to link Rice to the bombing. The next stage in the investigation came when the police were tipped off that one of the bombers was a teenager called Dwayne Peak.
Acting on information developed by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, agents of the FBI and investigators of the Omaha Police Division arrested Dwayne Peak, charging him with first-degree murder in the bombing death of patrolman Larry D. Menard
According to Dwayne Peake's uncle, once he was in custody, he told the police he'd made the bomb with members of his family.
At that particular time, David Rice and Ed Poindexter's name wasn't even mentioned. It was sometime later, I guess in the morning, when people came in and they wanted some good, I believe it's scapegoats or however you want to put it. They wanted something sensationalized. They wanted to go after the people that were making headlines, I believe.
According to his uncle, the police weren't interested in Dwayne Peake's story. They put pressure on him to implicate Rice and Poindexter in the bombing.
There were statements made to Dwayne like, you would be the youngest individual that would die in the electric chair. There were statements like, your family probably would suffer. You killed a police officer, and, it was a frightful experience. So it was very traumatic.
Once he was arrested, he was like a whipped puppy, and he, according to what they told me, he readily told them everything about what happened and how it happened. And he was just a young kid. He only, I think, 15, 16 years old.
That police mentality is once you hone in on a suspect, you do all you can to bring that to court and for the conviction. And sometimes we take shortcuts in order to convict someone, and sometimes we just do things that are just right down dishonest. And I think that once they honed in on David and Edward, that they just carried through and did it that way.
After changing his story several times, Dwayne finally told the police it was Rice and Poindexter who'd made the bomb. He claimed the bomb had been made in David Rice's kitchen after Poindexter had brought a box of dynamite up from the basement. Dwayne also claimed Ed Poindexter told him to plant the bomb at an empty house in North Omaha. He went on to say Poindexter gave him instructions to call the police to the house by dialing the emergency number from a payphone.
I did not make that bomb. I didn't conspire with anybody to make it. I didn't put Dwayne Peake up to delivering it or having anything to do with it. In fact, the only thing that I said to Dwayne during that period was, go away, you're suspended, grow up, because he was displaying some very bizarre behavior at that time. I had absolutely nothing to do with him making that bomb.
I don't know if I would have had whatever it takes to do that, because I had never really seriously hurt anybody that I know about, and to take the step of killing somebody, I don't know if I'd have been prepared to do that.
On the basis of Dwayne's evidence, the police decided to charge Rice and Poindexter with the bombing. Many months later, in a wave of publicity, the murder trial was held. According to prosecuting attorney Sam Cooper, Dwayne Peake was the key to the prosecution case.
The physical evidence, the dynamite, that's all we would have had, I think, without Dwayne Peake. And I suspect it would have been questionable whether you could have filed anything. It's pretty clear that absent the testimony of Dwayne Peake, it would have been a weak circumstantial case of murder. I mean, he was critical to the case.
Dwayne Peake's appearance in court as a witness was eagerly awaited. His was the only evidence which directly linked Rice and Poindexter to the bombing.
When Dwayne Peake walked into the courtroom that morning, he appeared to be like any normal young teenage black person who looked confident, smiled, and recognized individuals in the courtroom.
Dwayne Peake was called to the stand as a witness for the prosecution. His testimony stunned the court.
When he testified in the morning, he denied any involvement on my part or Ed. regarding the whole question of talking about a bombing or constructing a bomb or any of this. And I guess my reaction was, damn, this little dude is stronger than I could have guessed, because I know they've done some things to him or said some things to him that would scare the hell out of him. But somehow he's not going along with the program.
With those shocking disclosures shocking to the prosecution, the proceedings ended. At the request of the prosecutor, who asked that the preliminary hearing be continued to the afternoon. Afternoon proceedings occurred. Dwayne Peak comes in wearing sunglasses, looking visibly shaken, changed. I asked Dwayne Peak to take off his sunglasses.
His face around the eyes was swollen. It looked discolored to me. His eyes were red. It was clear he had been crying. And my impression at the time was that he had been struck physically, and that's what caused the discoloration and the marks around his eyes. When he took the glasses off, people in the courtroom let out an audible gasp.
Dwayne Christopher Peak had been really worked on between the morning session and the afternoon session. It was frightening to see what happened to that young man.
If it were any other set of circumstances, were he accusing some white person of an offense and changed his story as many times and as many ways as he did, his testimony would have been considered so lacking in credibility that it would not have been used for any purpose whatsoever. But because there were certain words they wanted to come out of his mouth to implicate these black men, they could change it, orchestrate it, until they got those words from him. And once the words came from him that they wanted, his mouth became a prayer book.
After Dwayne's changed testimony, the court session ended. That night, he wrote a letter home.
They had me in court today. I guess you already know that by now. The Lord knows I tried, but something happened which forced me to realize that I had no alternative but to say what I said. Mama, I'm going through hell. I don't know what to do, or how to do it, or what to say or how to say it. I can't find the words to say to the people I'm sorry. Most likely they'll probably prefer that I just die. I don't think I'll mind that at all. With love always, Dwayne C. Peak.
The trial continued with the introduction of forensic evidence. After their arrest, Rice and Poindexter's hands had been tested for traces of explosives. These tests were negative. However, the prosecution's forensic expert claimed that dust particles in their clothes had tested positive for the presence of dynamite. But on cross-examination, he admitted that the tests carried out might not have been exclusively for dynamite. In fact, they could have registered positive from a range of other substances. To lend weight to his case, the prosecutor claimed that Ed Poindexter was an explosives expert who'd served in Vietnam. This was untrue.
I was a medical aid man most of that time, and then I was a mechanic. You know, no experience with explosives. You know, that was just, again, you know, the press is in the FBI and the police department working in concert. That was their way of making me look as bad as possible. You know, this guy must have done such a thing. Cause look at him. You know, he looks like one of these big, burly, black. He got a beard, wears shades. You know, he's a Vietnam veteran. He must have done it. Look at him. You know, and he talks mean. You know, those are the images they put in people's minds, and it worked.
After all the evidence had been heard, Ed Poindexter and David Rice were found guilty.
Well, of course, police officers in that situation are always going to think about the death penalty. At that time, that was not possible in Nebraska. The maximum sentence available was life, is what Rice and Poindexter both received.
I was expecting it, but then, you know, there's no way you can prepare yourself emotionally for something like that, you know. I was numb for about an hour, and then after that, anger set in and resentment.
David Rice and Edward Poindexter are still in jail. In Nebraska, there is no parole in life sentences. Dwayne Peak, who testified against them, spent 4 years in youth custody and was released in 1974. He then disappeared. However, 20 years on, new evidence has emerged. At the trial, Dwayne Peake testified he telephoned the police on Ed Poindexter's instructions. Members of his family now maintain it was not Dwayne who called the police. All emergency calls are recorded as a matter of course. But in the early 1970s, the Omaha police claimed the only tape recording of Dwayne Peake's call had been destroyed. But in fact, the operator on duty on the night of the bombing made his own copy of the call. When he died recently, this tape turned up in Omaha.
Address 2866 or 2867 is Old Victor House. I mean, this dude that drug this woman up in there, she in there screaming and shit. I don't know what's going on. 2867 Ohio. 2866 and 2867 is Old Victor House with a bunch of weeds around it. Victor House. She's in there screaming and shit. What's your address, sir? My address is 2865. 65 Ohio. All right, we'll have an officer checking out, sir. Okay.
This tape was played to people who remembered Dwayne's voice.
Now, I had listened to Dwayne Christopher Peake testify for almost 3 days before the jury. I had taken 2 sets of depositions. I had sat with this young man for hours listening to him describe his actions, his contentions, his recollections, and heard his voice and was saturated with his voice. It is my opinion now that the voice on that tape was not Dwayne Christopher Peake.
When I heard this tape and realized that the deep voice of a much older man that I heard on this tape was the one they were saying was the voice of Dwayne Peake, this 15-year-old kid whose voice I knew, I couldn't believe it. Anybody who heard that tape would have to know that the whole story about Dwayne Peake having made a phone call to lure the police to that house would have known it was a lie. And for officials of the law enforcement branch to do something like that is reprehensible and inexcusable. And the fact that they did that made it clear to all of us that they knew David and Ed were innocent.
If the voice on the tape is not Dwayne Peake's, it's clear he was lying on oath. These newly obtained documents show the FBI was well aware of this perjury. The Omaha police and the FBI deliberately arranged for the tape recording to be suppressed because, in their words, it would be prejudicial to the case against Rice and Poindexter. In other words, they knew Peake was lying.
We feel we got the 2 main players in Rice and Poindexter. And I think we did the right thing at the time because the Black Panther Party, or whatever, by whatever name it was going by at the time of the murder, completely disappeared from the city of Omaha. Everybody disassociated itself from the Black Panther Party or their new names. And it's sort of been the end of that sort of thing in the city of Omaha, and that's 21 years ago.
After the imprisonment of so many of its leaders, the Black Panthers were effectively crushed as a political force in America. COINTELPRO, the FBI's counterintelligence program which helped destroy the Panthers, came to an end with the resignation of President Nixon. But almost 20 years on, its victims remain in jail.
I think that Nixon, Hoover, and that whole gang were adjudged to be criminals, and it was very clear that they participated in quite a bit of criminal activity. They were, in fact, criminals. But what people failed to do was to follow through on not just saying, okay, he's a criminal, he did the wrong, and leave it at that. You have to go and look at the crimes that they committed and then clean it up, so to speak, resolve the problems that they had begun. And that has not been done, and not only in my case, but in quite a few cases.
Now, I'm just a regular guy like everybody, you know, like most other guys are. And anybody with normal human emotions and feelings who would go through that type of thing would be bitter. In fact, if they weren't bitter, something would be wrong with them, you know. Something would be wrong upstairs if they weren't bitter, disappointed, angry. And I was at the time, especially in my first 2 or 3 years in prison, very much. But, you know, eventually you have to settle down and, you know, and realize that, hey, I'm here, I'm going to be here, why not just try to make something good out of this time and learn and grow from the experience and come out a better person.
So I don't regret anything I've done. And yeah, I paid a high price, but in a way you make your bed and you have to lie in it. If you talk bad about people who have things to hide, you know they're going to try to get you, and you have to be prepared for that. I mean, I talk about it now like it's, you know, like I speak of it, maybe I'm sounding like it's no big thing. It obviously is a big thing. But, you know, but what can you do? You make certain choices, man, and depending on the kind of society that you live in, you know, they make you pay a price. So when I first came down here, I just kind of saw myself as a casualty of my own failure to understand properly the seriousness of stuff. But after a time, yeah, you know, I've said to myself a bunch of times, man, folks, you know, step forward, let me go, damn it.
Despite the obvious injustice of their imprisonment, David Rice, Edward Poindexter, and Geronimo Pratt have little chance of being released. Without a change of political will, they seem destined to remain in jail, living witnesses to the fallibility of America's system of justice.